The night I realized my family had stopped listening to me. Nobody screamed. Nobody slammed a door. Nobody told me they didn't love me. It was much quieter than that. We were sitting around the dinner table, and I was trying to explain something that had been bothering me for weeks. My husband was checking his phone. My son was eating. My daughter was typing. I finally said, "Can everybody just listen to me for a minute?" My husband sighed. My son kept eating. Then my daughter looked at me and said, "Mom, what is it now?" I will never forget that sentence. It made me realize how they had started seeing me. I wasn't the mother trying to keep everyone together anymore. I was the person they expected to complain, correct, or lecture them. And instead of stopping, I did exactly what they expected. I started explaining myself. I reminded them about everything I did: the bills, the cooking, the appointments, the late nights, the things I remembered that everyone else forgot. My voice got louder. Their faces became more distant. Then my husband finally said, "You're always trying to make everybody listen to you." I froze, because that was exactly what I wanted. I wanted them to listen. But somehow my desperation to be heard had made them want to hear me even less. I pushed my chair back and walked into the kitchen. I stood there with both hands against the counter. I was angry, then embarrassed, then underneath all of it, I felt something worse. I felt alone. A question came into my mind that I didn't want to answer. What if my family wasn't the only problem? What if I had forgotten how to listen to them too? That question stayed with me for days. Then I told an older woman named Margaret. I expected sympathy. Instead, she asked, "When someone in your family disagrees with you, what do you normally do?" I said, "I explain my side." She looked at me and said, "That's not listening. That's preparing your defense." I didn't like hearing it, but I knew she was right. I couldn't ignore her anymore, and I knew it. Not this time. Then Margaret gave me 5 words. She told me they could change a conversation, but only if I meant them. She wrote the sentence on a small piece of paper and handed it to me. I looked down. "Help me understand what you mean." 5 simple words. I almost laughed. After all the arguments, tears, explanations, and frustration, this was her answer? But I folded that paper and put it inside my purse. I didn't know it yet, but those 5 words were about to change the way I spoke to my husband, my children, and even myself. And the next time my family stopped listening, I decided I would try something completely different. I wouldn't fight harder to be heard. I would listen first. The first time I used those 5 words, I almost backed out. It happened on a Tuesday evening. My son came home much later than he had promised. I had called him twice, and he hadn't answered. By the time he finally opened the front door, it was almost 9 o'clock. He dropped his bag near the sofa and started walking toward his room. I stopped him. "Where have you been?" "Out." 1 word, that was all he gave me. Normally, that would have been enough to start an argument. I would have followed him down the hallway asking questions. "Out where?" "Who were you with?" "Why didn't you call?" Do you know how worried I was? But that night I remembered the little piece of paper in my purse. I took a breath. Then I said, "Help me understand what happened tonight." My son stopped walking. He looked at me strangely, almost as if he had been expecting an argument. He shrugged. Nothing happened. I wanted to respond immediately. I wanted to say, "Then why were you gone so long?" But I stayed quiet. That silence felt uncomfortable. I realized how often I filled silence because I was afraid of what might come next. After a few seconds, my son sat down. Then he told me what had happened. He had argued with a friend at school. Someone had embarrassed him in front of other students. He had been angry and ashamed, and he didn't want to come home and take his frustration out on everyone. So he stayed with a friend for a while. Suddenly, his behavior looked different to me. I had seen a teenager ignoring his mother's calls. But underneath that behavior was a young man who was hurting. And because I asked instead of accusing, he finally told me. Still, I didn't simply let the issue go. I told him, I understand that you had a difficult day, but you still have to let me know you're safe. He nodded. Okay, Mom. He picked up his bag. Then just before he disappeared into his room, he turned around. Thanks for not yelling. I stood there for a moment after he left. That sentence affected me more than I expected, because I realized something. Listening hadn't made me weaker. I hadn't surrendered my authority. I had simply created enough space for my son to tell me the truth. And I learned another important distinction that night. Understanding someone doesn't mean agreeing with everything they do. You can understand why your child is angry and still correct disrespectful behavior. You can understand why your husband is hurt without accepting every accusation. You can understand why your daughter made a decision you dislike without pretending you agree. Listening isn't surrender, it's information. And when you have better information, you can respond with wisdom instead of reacting from emotion. That night, I put the little piece of paper back in my purse. But now those 5 words didn't feel silly anymore. They felt powerful. And a few days later, I would discover just how powerful they could be when I used them with my husband. A few nights later, my husband came home from work and barely spoke to me. He put his keys on the counter, took off his shoes, and went straight into the bedroom. I followed him. What's wrong? Nothing. That word again, nothing. In our house, nothing usually meant there was definitely something. Normally, I would have started guessing. Is it work? Are you angry with me? Did I do something? Then I would become frustrated and start defending myself before he had even accused me. But this time, I remembered the paper in my purse. I sat beside him. Then I said, "Help me understand what you mean." He looked at me. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he sighed. "I don't think you actually want to understand." It hurt. My first instinct was to defend myself. Of course I wanted to understand. I was his wife. I had spent years trying. I could feel the words forming in my mouth. I was ready to remind him of every sacrifice I had made and every problem I had helped solve. I stopped because I understood what Margaret had warned me about. If I asked someone to explain themselves while secretly preparing my defense, I wasn't really listening. I was simply waiting for my turn to speak. So I said, "Okay, tell me." He looked down at the floor. Then he said something I wasn't prepared to hear. "I feel like nothing I do is ever enough for you." I felt my chest tighten, because that wasn't how I saw myself. I thought I was encouraging him. I thought I was helping. I thought pointing out what needed to improve meant I cared. But he explained how it felt from his side. Every reminder sounded like criticism. Every suggestion sounded like disappointment. Every time I said, "We need to do better," he heard, "You aren't good enough." I wanted to tell him that wasn't my intention. Then I realized something I had never considered deeply enough. My intention wasn't the only thing that mattered. The impact mattered too. That night we talked for almost an hour. We didn't solve everything. There was no apology, no perfect ending. But something changed for the first time. We weren't trying to win. We were trying to understand. Before we went to sleep, my husband said, "I don't need you to agree with everything I say." He paused. "I just need to know that when I'm talking, you're actually hearing me." I couldn't forget that sentence. Suddenly I understood what my family had been trying to tell me. They weren't asking me to agree. They were asking me to stop preparing my answer long enough to hear what was in their hearts. And that's when those 5 words began to mean something completely different to me. Help me understand what you mean. They don't say, "You're right." They don't say, "I'm wrong." They open a door. And sometimes, when someone has felt unheard for a long time, that door is exactly what they need. My daughter was the hardest person for me to practice with. But my daughter, she could shut me out with one look. We had always been close, which was probably why our disagreements hurt so much. She was an adult now, making her own decisions. And there was one decision she had made that I strongly disagreed with. I believed she was making a terrible mistake. I told her so. She didn't argue. She simply looked at me and said, "Mom, you don't understand." Those words immediately triggered something inside me. I wanted to prove that I did understand. I started explaining every reason I thought she was wrong. I talked about consequences and the mistakes I had made at her age. She listened for a few minutes. Then she said, "See? This is exactly what I'm talking about." I stopped. "What do you mean?" She shook her head. "You don't listen. You just wait until I finish so you can tell me why I'm wrong." There it was again, the same truth Margaret had told me. The same thing my husband had told me. I looked at my daughter and realized I had been trying so hard to protect her that I hadn't given her enough room to become her own person. So I took a breath, and I said the words, "Help me understand what you mean." Then I did something harder than saying them. I stayed quiet. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her. I didn't prepare a response. I simply listened. For 20 minutes, my daughter told me what she was thinking, what she feared, and why she had made her decision. Then she said something I still remember. "Mom, I know you think you're protecting me, but sometimes I need you to trust that I've learned from my own life." I felt tears in my eyes because she was right. I had confused protecting someone with controlling the outcome. Those are not the same thing. When she finished, I told her, "I still don't agree with everything you're doing." She smiled. "I know, but I understand you better now." She nodded. Then she hugged me. That conversation taught me something I wish I had learned years earlier. Sometimes your family stops listening because they've learned that every conversation with you becomes a courtroom. If they tell you how they feel, you'll cross-examine them. If they share a decision, you'll challenge it. If they express pain, you'll explain why they shouldn't feel that way. Eventually, they stop talking, not because they don't love you, because they're tired of defending themselves. That realization changed my question. I stopped asking, "How do I make them listen to me?" I started asking, "How can I make this person feel safe enough to tell me the truth?" But I still had one important lesson to learn. Listening didn't mean allowing someone to disrespect me. Understanding someone didn't mean abandoning myself. There was one lesson I still hadn't learned. I had learned to pause. I had learned to listen. I had learned that understanding someone didn't mean agreeing with them. But then something happened that tested everything. One evening, a family member said something deeply disrespectful to me. It wasn't a disagreement. It wasn't frustration. It was an insult. And for a moment, I wondered if all this talk about listening meant I was supposed to sit there and accept it. Maybe I was supposed to be patient. Maybe I was supposed to understand their anger. But then I remembered something Margaret had told me. Listening doesn't mean abandoning yourself. Those words stayed with me, because sometimes we hear advice about being kind, patient, forgiving, and understanding, and we mistakenly believe that being loving means allowing people to treat us however they want. It doesn't. You can understand someone's pain and still have boundaries. You can forgive someone without giving them permission to hurt you again. You can listen without accepting disrespect. So that evening, I didn't shout back. I didn't insult them. I didn't bring up every mistake they had made in the past. I simply said, I want to understand what you're feeling, but I won't continue this conversation while we're speaking to each other this way. Then I walked away, and strangely, I felt stronger than I had during any argument. The old me would have stayed there for another hour trying to prove my point. I would have raised my voice. I would have said things I didn't mean. Then I would have spent the next morning regretting them. But this time I understood something. A boundary isn't revenge. A boundary is simply a decision about what you will and will not participate in. And that distinction changed the way I communicated. When I said, help me understand what you mean, I wasn't handing someone control over me. I was opening the door to a real conversation. I was saying, I am willing to hear you. But I was also allowed to say, I will not allow you to hurt me while we're talking. Both things could be true. And slowly, something unexpected began happening in my family. My son started telling me things before they became problems. My daughter started calling me when she needed advice instead of avoiding difficult conversations. My husband began telling me when something bothered him instead of keeping everything inside until it exploded. But the biggest change wasn't happening in them. It was happening in me. I wasn't desperate to be understood anymore. I stopped correcting every little misunderstanding. I became comfortable saying, I may be wrong. I learned to say, I hadn't thought about it that way. And those sentences no longer felt like weakness. They felt like freedom. Because when you don't need to prove that you're right all the time, you stop being afraid of being wrong. I finally understood that a healthy family doesn't need one person who always has the answers. It needs people who are willing to be honest, listen carefully, and respect boundaries. And then came the final lesson. Sometimes your family doesn't need another explanation from you. Sometimes they need to see that you've changed, and the next conversation would show me whether I truly had. Months later, I found myself sitting at the same dinner table, but this time something was different. My family was talking. My son was telling a story. My daughter was laughing. My husband was actually listening. And I realized I hadn't fought for anyone's attention. I had simply created a place where people felt safe enough to speak. So if your family has stopped listening to you, try something different. Don't raise your voice. Don't repeat yourself louder. Pause. Look at the person you love and say, help me understand what you mean. Then listen. Really listen. You don't have to agree. You don't have to surrender your boundaries. You don't even have to change your opinion. Just give the person a chance to finish being human in front of you. Because sometimes the conversation that changes a relationship doesn't begin with the perfect argument. It begins with the willingness to hear what you've been missing. And if this message spoke to you, subscribe to the channel. We're going to keep having conversations like this about family, respect, communication, and the things we often learn only after we've made mistakes. And before you leave, remember this: being heard begins with learning how to hear.